So Truman had the Korean War, he had pianos falling through the White House, and he had another event on October 1st, 1950, just months after the Korean War broke out. And Truman was a hard worker. He'd get up very early in the morning, but then he would take a nap after lunch. And he was actually napping on October 1st, 1950, on the second floor in the center, behind the center window in a little bedroom. And security then was laughable compared to today. You had the sentry guard buildings here and over here, with a couple of Secret Servicemen, a couple of policemen from the Washington, D.C., just 4 or 5 security men with the President of the United States during a major war. Pennsylvania Avenue then was a busy thoroughfare. It wasn't closed down. And they took their revolvers and began firing as the traffic went by them. And one of the D.C. policemen, Leslie Coffelt, was shot, mortally wounded, fell to the ground. Literally with his dying breath, he took his revolver and he shot down one of the would-be assassins of the president. And one of the Secret Servicemen in the area, Donald Birdsell, did a brilliant thing. Imagine if you're on guard duty here and 2 assassins come rushing towards you. Your inclination would be to rush into the building, right? And take cover, maybe grab an automatic rifle inside, maybe try to get help. Donald Birdsell did a brilliant thing. Instead of rushing into the building, he rushed out into the street, past the assassins, firing as he did, throwing their fire towards him and away from the president's building. He shot down the other assassin. I'll show you a picture. At this very stoop, this very railing, this is the dead assassin, right at the foot of the steps. Amazing photograph, right where we're standing. Face down is like something out of a gangster movie in the 1950s. He's even dressed like a gangster with the fedora hat and the suit.
And who were they working for again?
There were 2. There were 2 men, and maybe 25 bullets fired in all in the middle of the mayhem. And there were cars swerving and people screaming. In the middle of the mayhem, Truman wakes up. He's awoken by the gunfire. He pokes his head out of the center second floor window. See what the hell is going on. The old artillery commander from the First World War. Pedestrians in the street are horrified to see him, and they go back inside, Mr. President, go back inside. Truman's head ducks back inside. After 30 seconds or so, silence. The names of the would-be assassins were Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola. Can you guess from their names what their intents were? What their backgrounds and intents? Yes, ma'am.
Puerto Rican independence?
I think you know this already. I should preface my questions that if you actually know the answer, don't answer. That's actually absolutely correct. One of the people talk about the election of 2016 as being one of the most contentious in American history. Maybe, but there were others far more so. 1860 is hard to beat for a wild election, but 1800 isn't bad. It was one of the most vicious in American history. You had that was the Jefferson versus John Adams election, and you had both men hiring muckrakers to drag each other through the mud. And Jefferson wins the popular vote, but the electoral college vote is very narrow. He really wins by just 1 vote. And one of his electors, incredibly, votes for the wrong man. He doesn't vote for Jefferson, he votes for another man in the electoral college, leading to a tie. Jefferson's running mate, vice presidential running mate, is Aaron Burr, a rather slippery character from New York. And he says, I'm tied with the presidential candidate, maybe I should be president, not him. And he tries to become president in the electoral college and making a number of deals. Tremendous deadlock ensues, over 30 votes, electoral college, complete deadlock. Until who steps in to save Jefferson? His arch rival, not John Adams, but Alexander Hamilton, the star of a play on Broadway right now. Hamilton reasons that Jefferson, he doesn't agree with Jefferson on anything, but the man is intelligent and patriotic, where Aaron Burr is slippery as a snake and can't be trusted at all. So he pushes his support to Jefferson, and he gets elected as president in 1800, sweeps the overwhelming victory in 1804. Seems on his way to that very successful 2 terms until that embargo act, that pesky embargo act of 1807. and then having the seconds call out 1, 2, 3, and then fire. What they did was, at the Decatur-Baron duel, they stood 3 steps apart. Does anyone know why they stood such a short distance apart?
They were such poor shooters. They couldn't see.
Can anyone guess?
They couldn't see.
Commodore Baron
Was very dull.
was nearsighted, but he hated Decatur, and he wanted to be sure he shot him. So
wasn't there a rule for him to be down there?
the normal rule was 10 paces, but you were allowed to change the rules of the duel according to a request by one or both of the duelists. And Commodore Baron requested instead of 10 paces, they fire at 3 paces. If you can imagine this, these 2 Commodores, one of them a great war hero, with the dueling pistols blasting away from that distance. Needless to say, both men crumpled to the ground. Baron was very badly wounded, but he survived. He lived until something like 1859. He was never cashiered in the Navy after that. Decatur knew he was mortally wounded on the shot, and he was carried back from Bladensburg to the Decatur house along those rickety roads at the time in a carriage in agony, up and down, bouncing in the carriage. He was carried into the Decatur house, and his dying words were to spare his wife's Susan Wheeler Decatur. He didn't want her to see him in his death throes and his agony. So he had his seconds, his friends, take him into the living room and close the doors so he could die in peace. But he bequeathed all his wealth to his wife, and that was his last act. The good thing that came out of the Decatur-Baron duel was that the Navy abolished duels after that. No more dueling among our senior officers. President Washington needed it was a very small government, and Washington needed someone with architectural knowledge to help him help him construct the White House and Capitol building along with Pierre Lafayette. And so he turned to his Secretary of State, and he said, can you help me find an architect for the White House? And the Secretary of State actually held a raffle. He asked for architects all around America to submit drawings for the new president's mansion. And it's said that the Secretary of State may have slipped in his own plans for architectural for the White House. But actually, he and Washington both fell in love with this drawing. And architectural historians are convinced that this chateau that Minister of France Jefferson came upon, that he and Washington gave those sketches to James Hoban, the architect of the White House. And he drew upon this quite heavily to construct what's behind us. And that's the secret history of the construction of the White House, among other things. And so that's why the 2 are represented that way. Lafayette had very close relations with 4 American 2-time presidents, 2-term presidents in the early years. With Jefferson as Minister to France, with George Washington especially, because during the Revolution, it was Lafayette more than any other Frenchman who brought the French on the American side to help the Americans win their independence, getting the superpower of France on their side. And Lafayette named his son after George Washington. And after the Revolution fell into a bloody mayhem, the Reign of Terror and the guillotine and all that, Tale of Two Cities, Lafayette was actually thrown into jail by Robespierre and the other French revolutionaries. But the next American minister to France, James Monroe, and his wife valorously went through the mobs of the Tale of Two Cities, Paris, who, almost lynched by the mobs, went to the prison where Lafayette and his family were kept and managed to get them released, and they were able to flee France. However, he was a revolutionary himself, and when he made it to the monarchical countries of Europe, Austria, for instance, they put him in jail again as a revolutionary, even though he opposed the most bloodthirsty of the revolutionaries. That is during the George Washington administration, and it gave George Washington a dilemma: what to do about this great friend of the American Revolution. If he came out publicly calling for his release, he would alienate the kings of Austria and of England, and he wanted to keep peace with all parties, Washington. So what he did was he got the brother of John Marshall, his friend John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, James Marshall, to engage in quiet backdoor diplomacy. And James Marshall traveled to Austria, where Lafayette was in a dungeon for years, wasting away, and he convinced the Austrian monarch to release the great man, and so he lived through the horrible revolutionary days and Napoleonic Wars of Europe. In 1824, as an old man, he comes back to the United States. Huge touring from Massachusetts, where he meets an elderly John Adams, down to Monticello, meets an elderly Jefferson, and he comes to Washington, D.C. Who is president in 1824? A man whose life, he had saved Lafayette's life at the Battle of Brandywine in the American Revolution. A young American officer named James Monroe had come upon the wounded Lafayette in battle and had nursed him, cared for him until an army surgeon came along. The two men were close friends for life, so that when Lafayette visited America in his great tour of 1824, President Monroe had him over to the White House for a banquet, and he named the square after his old friend, Lafayette Square. That's where the name comes from. These close associations. And an amazing event happened in 1824, because if you recall from early in the tour, 1824 was the stolen election, where John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay connived to steal the election from Andy Jackson, and the corrupt bargain of 1824. And when James Monroe threw a banquet for Lafayette and for Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, the president-elect, and for Andy Jackson, all to come to a banquet together, people were terrified what Andy Jackson would do. And Andy Jackson went into the banquet room with his 2 revolvers on his side, as he often had when walking around town. Would he kill John Quincy Adams? Would he challenge Henry Clay to a duel? Nobody knew. President Monroe, Marquis de Lafayette were very worried. The door swung open to the banquet room. Andy Jackson entered, guns to his side. He started walking towards John Quincy Adams. Across the room, his eyes fixed on him. Marquis de Lafayette then had a brainstorm. He rushed across the room himself, and he greeted Andy Jackson. He said, "General, it's so great to see you here, and with all these other fellow American friends of mine. I'm so happy to be here with this banquet with you. Why don't you come join the rest of us?" And so Jackson was a little bit taken aback, and he probably didn't really intend any harm, but he walked up to John Quincy Adams and said, "Mr. President-elect, congratulations, I wish you success." And the tension in the room was broken, partly because of Marquis de Lafayette. This is another story. During his tour, when he was in Boston visiting John Adams, in Boston, he went to the inaugural opening of a battlefield from the American Revolution in Charleston, Massachusetts, the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill. And while he was there, at the opening ceremonies of the Battle of Bunker Hill, he borrowed a shovel from a local workman, and he started shoveling on the battlefield and taking soil and putting it into some sacks and burlap bags. And then he took the bags with him at the end of the speech and the end of his ceremony with him. And when he died some years later in France, outside of Paris, he had the soil for the Battle of Bunker Hill spread over his remains so that he could claim to be buried in American soil as the greatest friend of the American Revolution. That's why this square is and should be named after Lafayette. He was truly a great man.